Rijeka. This is a postcard, obviously. Many of you know this, but I'll just tell you again quickly. Rijeka is a post-industrial coastal city in Croatia, the third largest city in Croatia. As you know, I was invited by, as I just said, I was invited by Musagetes to propose a project there. This kind of invitation is an amazing, wonderful invitation, but also one that has a lot of complications. Ones that I think Musagetes is working through in a really meaningful way, but nevertheless, being a Canadian foundation, inviting a Canadian artist to a small Croatian city, come in, don't worry, is one that involves a lot of sort of like critical questioning about what are we all doing here, and what's the goal, and this funding going through me into a local project for which local artists really don't have these kinds of opportunities for the most part. And so these kinds of questions are ones that are, of course, forefront in my mind when I'm doing these kinds of works, and that was certainly no exception for this project. There are certain benefits to being an outsider in a community, as in the case of this project, one of them was the kind of like your ignorance can sometimes be a strength because there's obviously, when you're going into a small community like that, a lot of interpersonal politics that already exist. And when you're oblivious to those, you can really make a lot of things happen that wouldn't have happened with someone who's local. So that's, I think, what happened with this project as well. One of the very first things I heard about it, in fact, it was the very first morning that I arrived in the city. My first meeting was with a man named Ivan Šarar, who is the head of the Department of Culture of the city of Rijeka. And I had a meeting with him and Alyssa. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and we were both very jet-lagged. And he told us a story of this proposal for a site that at the time I knew nothing about, a post-industrial site that had been sitting empty, to convert, to redevelop and convert this site into the home of cultural industries and some of the city's main institutions, cultural institutions. The main tenant was, or the main institution was the MMSU, which is the Museum Moderne Umjetnosti, which is the MMSU's logo on the side there. So I'm going to have to move this so it's not pointing at the speaker. The proposal was scrapped. It was a massive proposal for the city. It was scrapped by the Department of Culture because it was, frankly, they couldn't afford it, and it was a process that many people found to be very painful. But this story, which was the first story that I heard, and I heard it really sort of from the horse's mouth, from Ivan, was immediately piqued my interest because of, I've been sort of following and somewhat involved with the move of Vancouver Art, not involved, but sort of like, you know, an observer of the politics around the move of Vancouver Art Gallery to a new site, different kinds of proposed sites, observing in many, many places where I'd worked how culture and cultural industries are used as a driver for development and for gentrification and for all kinds of other stuff. And so this like really sort of fit into interests that I already had. And when I heard the story, I was immediately interested in fact, this is the site that we ended up working in. I should say that all of those kinds of like very critical ways of looking at this kind of development, I think are and aren't the case for this site in Rijeka. It's also one that's been, as you'll hear, because I'll speak more about it, but it's not a typical site in that regard. It would be in Western Europe or in North America. So this site, as I went on to learn, is an extremely important site in the history of the city. This is a map from 1755. When the site was developed as the administrative headquarters for a sugar refinery by a Dutch trading company named Polly and Arnold. In the 18th century, they employed 1,000 workers when the city population was only 5,000. So you can imagine how important that industry was. It was the very first industry of the city that then became a very, very important industrial center in the entire region, not just in what is now Croatia, but in the entire region for the centuries afterwards. Here's a photograph of the building, the administrative headquarters of this sugar refinery that is a rebuilt version of it. Still sits on that site from 1824. Of course, this was the start of a lot of spin-off factories that got built in the city because of this massive employer. They needed other kinds of things like rope, like bags, like all kinds of things. And so these other factories began, and thus Rijeka had its industrial beginnings. In 1830, this drawing is sort of 1832, so you see the building on the waterfront there. Since that's since changed, that whole area has been filled in. There's a railway there and a station. In 1834, the building became an armory. There was a time of great conflict, and later transitioned to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of course, before it was in the Habsburg monarchy. In 1851, the government purchased the factory from the city. We're still talking about times, but there's a lot of changes going on in the city, and established a tobacco factory. And in fact, the tobacco factory was again a very important site. Many more buildings were built. It was an important industry. Many buildings were constructed on the site to facilitate the production of all kinds of tobacco products. And one of the really remarkable things about this factory at the time was that women were working there. Women who were largely speakers of the Fiuman dialect, which is a dialect that is specific to Rijeka, and it's a Venetian dialect. So it was a really important cultural phenomenon in the city that there were so many women who had jobs, who had a certain amount of social mobility. The tobacco factory ceased production in 1944, and after the war and after the formation of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and the state reorganization of industries that were of course all run by the state at that time, this site became known as the Back Benčić factory, where a number of different former factories were sort of conglomerated, and they started to make machine parts, specifically ship parts for the shipyards, propellers, porthole windows, all kinds of various kinds of machining. So they were working mainly in metal and working with machinery manufacturing in a very precise way. Here's a photograph from the Back Benčić factory. Now I should say a little bit about Back Benčić. He was a partisan and a so-called national hero. He'd worked at the Mateus school factory, which was one of the factories that was conglomerated into the Back Benčić factory. He was killed in the war and became of course, fighting with the anti-fascists, and then became the namesake of not only this factory but many other sites and roads in Rijeka. And it's an interesting story because he was only 22 when he was killed, and there's a lot of speculation about why him. Probably because he was young enough that there were no scandals or whatever, and they could easily make him into this sort of figurehead. But this is something that the children that we worked with really picked up on and romanticized this biography of this young man. I should say something about the closing of the Back Benčić factory. So it really was a very, very large complex, and one that continued to be very important in the city, where a large percentage, when you think about it, I don't know exactly what percentage in this case, but a very large percentage of the city's population really worked in this factory. It was one of the very well-known and very well-functioning, highly functioning worker-organized factories that Yugoslavia was well known for. The workers really managed their own factories, and this was a place that the workers were very proud of. And everyone in Rijeka has a relative or a friend or witness who worked in the Back Benčić factory. It's very well known. So it's a place that somehow is still kind of in the hearts of the people in this way. And it was closed in the early to mid 90s during the war and after independence of Croatia, when of course all the privatizations were going on. And the workers were let go in an attrition that has never been publicly admitted, but which was ethnically motivated during the war. So, of course, Serbian workers were fired first, and so on. A dear friend and colleague, Nadia Mistopic, who also Musagetes will be working with in the future, and Marin Jukanovic, another filmmaker from Rijeka, made a very nice film about interviewing these workers and about this process, where the former workers actually come back into the building and speak about their experiences there and the experiences of getting fired. It's called in English Back Benčić, for example, and you can find it online. Maybe someday it'll be screened here. Okay. So also this kind of thing. So these are, I just basically took some headlines from Rijeka Novi List is the main newspaper there, and did a bad translation of it. But this is an example of newspaper articles that were being written about this proposal and the failure of this particular version of the proposal to be realized in the city. And this kind of so basically here you just have various people being interviewed. This is the kind of way that the conversation happens publicly in the city, right? It's very heated and it's very contested, and it's also very painful. The site now is, because it's been sitting empty, because the buildings, and these are just various kinds of comments, but because the reader comments, because the site has been sitting empty and the buildings really deteriorating, and they're buildings that are meaningful in the place. It is a painful place in the city in a way. And this is what it looks like now. Another thing that I was doing when I was there, besides taking tours of abandoned factories, was meeting with children's theater groups, and I realized that there were really a lot of them in Rijeka, and none of them had worked together before. They were doing different kinds of sort of techniques and different kinds of approaches, but nevertheless there were a lot, and they were doing really great work. And I'd never worked with children before, but when I started attending some of these rehearsals and seeing how the different directors worked with them, there was something very particular about how the child performers are always, when they're focused, they're extremely focused, and it's mesmerizing. But that intensity is very easily broken, and then they're completely out of character. There's something also very kind of radical about that. With the children, I noticed that, of course, there's a desire to please and to obey, but then a very quick shift to kind of gratification and play and a kind of wildness, which is very interesting and amazing to be around. Yes, and I wrote something about the dialectics of the children's behavior. Somehow also seemed to match these historical dialectics that I was looking at, through which the building, of course, is an exemplar, is a site through which the history of the city can be read, through different conflicts and wars and different kinds of occupying imperatives. The building as a site has really is one through which all kinds of deep history can be read and all kinds of historical shifts. So I thought that was also something that would be interesting to explore. Now, this is a list of the different theater groups who I worked with, the main performance groups who I worked with in Rijeka. Chudesnya Blacek, experimental narrative theater, improvisational process, and I worked with director Nataša Tepša. Krila, Ivana Perinic, and Jorge Curia Bethencourt work with mostly experimental, mostly movement-oriented theater. Tri-theater, Ivan Lorinsa, the director. English language theater is interesting. Ivan had spent a lot of time in the United States and wanted to bring his English theater back to Rijeka. But his work is all scripted. He writes the scripts, so they're not classic scripts, but he writes them for the particular group of children, and most of them are fairly comedic. School for Classical Ballet and Contemporary Dance in one of the elementary schools, directed by Kate Foley. Most of the work they do is modern and contemporary, but again, she develops it with the performers through improvisation. Malik was the children's theater group associated with the National Theater, so they were doing classical dramatic theater. And then we put together a group that we just called Extra Group, and Natalie Bozic was mainly directing them. And they were children performers with different backgrounds. Some had a background in drama, some had a background with choir and singing, some debating, and some from visual art. I had permission from the city, it was a really sort of extraordinary opportunity through Musagetes and through their collaboration with the Department of Culture in Rijeka to have keys to this complex, to be allowed to enter, occupy, and work in this site that the city owns and administrates. It was just, you don't get that very often, right? And that this was absolutely the case in Rijeka. As well, the opportunity to work with these different directors of different children's performance groups who were willing to come on board and who were willing to, with the exception of one group who didn't have time and took a different role in the film, who were willing to turn their participation in this project into the work for the season. Of course, each season the theater group has a different program. They're working on this play or they're working on this production. In the cases of all of these groups, they made their participation in this project their work for that fall, right? So that they were only working on this project. So that was also an extraordinary opportunity. The other element, the other piece of the puzzle was the story. And the story was one that I came up with, but just a skeleton of a story, which was the story of an occupation, of these performers taking roles that are very loose, that are somewhere between workers and artists, who have an association with that site, with that building, with the factory, with its history, and decide to occupy it, to take it over and to use it for their own purposes. That's the story. And from there, the kids filled in the rest. One of the reasons that I was sort of thinking about this is, of course, the recent history of the site, what was happening and most importantly not happening in the site, and also my own sort of history being in places. I was doing a residency in Berlin at the Kunsthaus Botany, and this was in 2005, 2006. The squatters moved into one of the wings of the building at that time and had squatted the building, were doing all kinds of activities while I was a resident there. And so I was it made a big impression on me. And observing their work, and also the kinds of local conflicts that caused, and the kind of the way that they were dealing with it, and their relationship with the local community in Preuzmimo and all of that. I'd also been in Buenos Aires maybe 3 years previous, and visited what are the so-called 3 of the so-called recovered factories that workers go back and actually reoccupy factories after the owners have left and turn them into factory co-ops. So I'd actually seen this in Argentina. And so I was, of course, thinking about these things in relation to what I was observing in Rijeka. The political situation in Croatia, the privatizations and the foreign sales of land and resources, which many people describe as criminal, and the difficulty for people to secure basic housing, the unemployment situation, also has made many young artists who didn't have space to work, and yet there's all of this empty spaces owned by the city of Rijeka that they're unable to do anything with because the city's in a very difficult economic situation. So it seemed to me like a natural action, like why not just go and squat, right? But no one was doing it, so I was curious about that. And I learned more about that later. I don't have time to explain it all, but it's a very complicated situation, but there are reasons for these things, of course. But at the time, it was a naive question, but one that gave me a story. Also, I mean, what happened in the work was that the story was a story, but it became real because that's what we did, right? The kids took over the building, and we worked there, and then we documented it. So there's something to this, the gesture becoming a gesture in the world that has actual stakes. I'll just tell you a little bit about the process. So the first thing I did was establish a relationship with the collaborators, like those groups. There were a few others who had smaller roles in the production, but nevertheless really important ones. The first time that all of the parents and most of the children came together to meet each other was a picnic that we organized in the grounds of the Benčić factory. So basically, because the kids were all coming from different groups, they didn't know each other. They knew the performers who were working in their groups, but they didn't know anyone else. So it was important for them to meet each other, and also for us to have a sense of like how it would be possible for us to work together. Also, I mean, you saw the condition of the site. It had since been cleaned up, but nevertheless, we're talking about an abandoned factory that is a dangerous place even for adults. And to bring kids into that place, we had to be very careful. And we also had to see like what they would think of it, you know, what their reaction would be. And they hadn't been inside before, and this is the first time that they came inside. So there were, you know, some games and workshops and exercises that afternoon to just sort of do some testing. Meanwhile, that was happening. I was speaking to the parents because, of course, they had a lot of questions. One of the things that I felt important to tell them, that I can tell you now, because it's also important, I think, not just in this project, but in how I'm working in general, is that performers, subjects are coming together and working on film or some other kind of project that's eventually destined to become something that has a home in the contemporary art world. They're not people who have the same sense of art history, reasons for participating in a work that I would and that perhaps my peers would. And so this is like obviously a question of potential kind of like power dynamics, exploitation, like communication problems too, or communication questions, right? So I found over the years, working on these kinds of projects, that really two things are important things. One is that the subjects and collaborators and crew members and performers or whoever that I'm working with, the project has to be a very rewarding and important and challenging and amazing project for them on their terms, whatever terms those might be. And I want to make a really great contemporary artwork. But that those two considerations are always ones that I try to keep in balance. And so this is something that I try to explain to the parents. Also, just some of the sort of like ideas that I hope to sort of tease out of the project. And some of those were relationship between work and play and art making, which is something that inevitably is the case when you're working with kids. Or questions of the worker as a key member of society has shifted radically. I mean, it's shifted radically all over the world. In Croatia, as an example, of course, given that the worker was a sort of like key unit of socialism, right? And that's changed massively. Basically what was happening in the very first month was that all of the different groups, after they met each other at the picnic, they were working separately with their own groups in their own spaces. At that time, we were cleaning the Benčić area and getting it ready for the kids to move into. Of course, you have that many children, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of things you have to do. You have to get a childcare team, you have to get ready to prepare food all the time, you have to make it safe, you have to have a place. In this case, we had to prepare like a sort of playroom, green room area, prepare an area for costumes and costume building, all this kind of stuff. So that was a big job, so that was what we were working on at that time. Water, there was no water in the building. Sanitary, there was no sanitary in the building, i.e. toilets, so we had to deal with all of that stuff. Then when the kids finally came together, our first rehearsals, bringing in the different groups together, many exercises, writing, drawing, working with the childcare team so that when the kids weren't actually working with the directors, whatever activities that they were doing were somehow kind of related to being there and the reason for being there, but not really heavy, and ones that would be a kind of like, you know, outlet for them. To other things that were sort of like quite prominent in my mind were notions of the shifting labor market in terms of thinking through the worker and these roles that kids were taking on. And that's especially the case in the Croatian economy that's now built around tourism and service industries, a shift to sort of like a dematerialized production by the service industry. And of course, art and culture fits into that as well, and the site's relationship with supposedly being a site for the development of creative industries as this kind of like promise of a new economy, right? So many of the exercises we did also were related to the space itself and relationship with the body and the space. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know what the film was, we didn't know what the activities that we were going to do necessarily. Every day we sort of would have ideas. We would work on those ideas with the cast, and then at the end of the day, the directors and myself would get together and talk about what just happened, what we needed to do the next day. So it really was this kind of amazing process of trying things, of experimenting, seeing what worked, seeing what didn't work, and then on a daily basis discussing it. So we did things like the children imagined themselves as workers and wrote bios for those workers who were former employees of the factory. Debates, like actual debates, political debates about what to do with the building and its future proposals. Movement based on the physical structure, history lessons, rewriting of history, fictionalizing history, playing with their sounds, with their voices in the space. Other things like newspaper headlines, like the ones that you saw in many others. We would give the cast a newspaper headline and they would have to write the story about the space, sort of like preparing them to take over the project, really. Here's a shot of the costume room. Just a few quick words on the costumes. The concept, Tamar Janati was the costume designer. She worked with a really wonderful team, but they designed the costumes really in collaboration with each performer. The performer would come in, they would try something on, they didn't like this, they didn't like that, they needed to modify this, and it was really a process, and a really incredible and painstaking process at times, where they built each costume individually based on feedback of each kid. Some of the notions that we were talking about with the components and the pieces of the costumes. We saw this group of cast members who were occupying the building as having to visually demonstrate a relationship with tradition. And I was thinking, perhaps somewhat perversely, but also not, about this kind of gesture of taking back a building, of occupying a building, as one that's actually quite traditional, but in terms of particular kinds of strategies for enacting social and political change, a fairly traditional strategy. And also this sort of like break with a certain notion of tradition, not really understanding how to set yourself up to have a relationship with the past, but just doing it anyways. And so you'll see that the costumes have a sort of improvisational sense to them. So once we started to get into production, I'll just show you a few photographs of scenes. There are many, many scenes that we shot. I made a 1-hour film. I had like 14 hours of scenes, so I had to get rid of a lot of stuff. This is one that didn't make it into the film, but ended up being fairly important, where the kids did a public march on the main street. It's called the Corso. It's the pedestrian shopping corridor of the city, directly into the building, where they were chanting things that they had made up themselves in preparation for this. But it was a way for them to publicly articulate their relationship with the city, their relationship with that site, and to actually physically go into the space in a public way. And I realize now that it was very important for them to do that in order for them to they felt very strong and entitled to be there. They knew that they could be more powerful than us as crew members and as directors, right? So they sort of got a sense of this real notion of sort of like collective organizing and action through making this scene happen. These are some discussions that were happening with the kids, some discussions with the crew members, probably a crew meeting before the cast arrives. Because also when you're working with children, of course, a lot of things happen that you don't expect to happen. It's all improvisation. There was no script. So when something happens, they need to be ready. With sound, they need to be ready with cameras. That's very challenging. So it was like we had to help each other a lot. We also had people coming in from outside to speak to the kids and work with them about the history of the site and about different notions of performance. This is Diachik, and he was a local historian, an industrial history expert, really generous guy. The guy you see in the middle back there is Demir Gordon. He's a kind of pop star in Croatia, and he did some vocal exercises with them. We had Canadian experts attending. There's Demir again. He's doing some vocal work with some of the singers. The process, of course, was a very, very important part of this project. What happened? All kinds of things happened that we didn't film. All kinds of things were filmed, but not in the film. The film is one kind of tangible result of this project, but there are all kinds of others. I can speak a little bit about how I see being involved in this project as transformational for the kids, And one of those things is that we could see, what we could see happening, and I hope this will continue with the Youth Council, one of the things that we could really see happening was the kids feeling a sense of engagement and a real relationship to their city, to that site, to its history, and a sense that this is their place and this is a conversation that they're actually participating in, that that conversation has stakes, and that their ideas and their participation is important. Like, we saw that happening. They really did take ownership of the site while they were in it. They felt like it was theirs. They had strong opinions about what should happen with it. So this was something that that we didn't know that this would happen, but it did, and perhaps we shouldn't have been surprised. But I really hope that sense of participation in the social and political fabric of the city is something that continues for them. I don't know that it will, but something started. I learned a lot, but I wanted to say something about love. And as a political concept. And I learned about that working on this project. I was leading a residency at the Banff Center a few years ago that was put together with a sort of like academic and theoretical residency. And one of the leaders of that residency was Michael Hart. He's an American philosopher and political writer. He writes a lot with Tony Negri. And he was giving a lecture, and he's spoken a lot about love as a political concept. And for Michael Hart, he sees the possibility of love as a social muscle that's developed through a way of working that isn't hierarchical, and a political principle that is accomplished through work. And I always thought of his work as being a little bit hippie, and now I think I understand what he's talking about, and I really relate to it, because not that you don't have this sort of sense of respect and affection and independence and admiration for the people you work with on projects all the time. But there was something particular about this, I think partly because it was multi-generational, because we were working with performers as young as 6. And so you have people from 6 years old to their early 40s, really working together, making decisions together, and really relying on each other's decisions to make something happen that we didn't really know where it was going, but just to sort of steer it. And this is what I learned from it, and it was really profound, and it continues to be something that I think about all the time. And I just wanted to show you this. This was one of the installations that the kids made when we were on site, called The Wall of Decency, and they drew either poo or ice cream. And this somehow relates to, for me, the kind of dialectics of the whole project.